esta nueva edición de la Convención Nacional del Café que la Cámara Peruana de Café organiza hace ya 24 años. Cumpliendo siempre con los objetivos de la institución, estamos tratando de llevar cada año estas convenciones de manera de ayudar a que el negocio de café, las exportaciones peruanas, se profesionalicen a través de este tipo de eventos de capacitación y también de información respecto a los eventos que ocurren en el mercado internacional, ¿no? La mayor parte del café se exporta, así que la dependencia de los mercados internacionales es muy alta y es importante que los exportadores y todos los que están vinculados a la cadena de café estén informados de lo que ocurre en el exterior. Por esa razón, en esta primera etapa de la convención, que es la parte virtual, hemos invitado a participar a 2 expertos internacionales muy reconocidos en el ámbito comercial del café, que son la señora Judith Gaines, que es una experta, analista de mercado, especialmente en lo que se llama soft commodities, café, cacao y azúcar. Es muy reconocida, es muy seguida a nivel internacional, su opinión pesa mucho, y ella desarrolla un trabajo de investigación y de visitas de campo, particularmente en Brasil, que es el principal jugador en este negocio, y hace evaluaciones de la realidad fundamental, o sea, de los elementos que puedan afectar los precios del café del lado de la oferta y la demanda. Y por otro lado, hemos invitado a otro experto muy reconocido también a nivel nacional, el señor Carlos Brando, de PA Peñalense, que está especializado en el desarrollo de políticas y estrategias para aumentar el consumo interno en los países productores. Así que, nuevamente agradeciéndoles por la presencia, por la atención, e invitándolos a participar también en la parte presencial que se va a llevar a cabo la próxima semana. Los dejo ahora en las palabras de David para que presente la exposición que va a ser, que dejó de grabar, mejor dicho, Judy Gaines, que estoy seguro va a ser de mucho interés y ustedes van a estar muy satisfechos con la información que se va a verter. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Lucho. Saludo y agradezco a la Cámara la oportunidad. Son 24 convenciones que lo que buscan es transmitir información confiable sobre los temas de coyuntura, apoyar a los sectores con información, con una toma de decisiones de alguna manera informada, con información sólida. Y hoy me acompaña Tony Arbe para comentar este panel. La señora Judith Gaines, como bien lo dijo Lucho, tiene más de 40 años en el mercado, en particular trabajando con los futuros de café en la Bolsa de Nueva York. Ha sido analista senior de Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley, Prudence, y desde hace más de 20 años desarrolla una firma consultora propia que tiene más de 8.000 seguidores, líderes del sector, que van en busca de la opinión de Judith, que buscan de alguna manera que nos muestre su punto de vista sobre cómo analizar el mercado con la información disponible. La presentación que hoy vamos a compartir es la estadística actual, las tendencias actuales de precios, inventarios y futuros para el café. Judith, nosotros hemos hecho la traducción, ustedes van a poder leer la traducción o escuchar en inglés para los que puedan. Y nos dejan sus comentarios, tanto Tony Arbe como yo debatiremos al final. Y hemos quedado con la señora Judith Gaines que todas las preguntas que se hagan en esta sesión vamos a abordarlas en vivo con ella el 23 de junio como parte de la convención. Entonces, antes de arrancar, como les digo, me acompaña el señor Tony Arbe, que ha sido gerente de Café y de CAMSA, Cafetalera Amazónica, y es uno de los más expertos en el tema de precio y comercialización de café en el Perú. Entonces, saludo a Tony, gracias por acompañarnos y comencemos con esta transmisión.
Good morning. This is Judy Gaines, and it is with pleasure to be with you virtually today to talk about the outlook for the coffee market. And I certainly want to thank the sponsors, the hosts, for inviting me to speak with you. For those that don't know me, a little bit of my background. I have nearly 40 years covering the coffee market and cocoa, as well as other commodities as a market analyst and fundamental perspective. I'm also the co-founder of Taka Insights, which is a new platform that takes big data and synthesizes it into an easy to understand format. And it's basically taking market fundamentals and analyzing the market and putting it into a very concise format to make instant reactions on the market. And this certainly is an avenue where big data is headed, and there's a lot of discussion about the way forward in analyzing markets. And so it's nice to be at the frontier of that. As far as the market, I just want to talk to you about the fundamentals for coffee and put it into a historical context, because it's very important to understand where the market is today relative to past moves when we've been at these higher levels to make an assessment of the way forward. So last year, certainly we had a dramatic move in the market, and that continued into the early part of this year. And we've seen the Arabica market and the London Robusta market back off from those highs. Now, we're only first starting to harvest the troubled Arabica 22-23 crop. And yet the market has had a year to digest all the numbers and expectations for that crop that was hurt by drought and by 3 frosts last July. And so the market has discounted that already into the price and is starting to look forward to the next Brazilian crop, which is the 23-24 crop year, as opposed to focusing on the crop that is about to be harvested. In addition, the higher prices help to cool demand a little bit in terms of there was some switching away from higher priced Arabica to lower priced Robusta coffee. And you could see that in the spreads, and the market reacts to that. Now, we're still at relatively high levels compared to where coffee has been in the past when we've had strong moves. So I want to put the market position in a little bit more contextual framework and take the market back to, swing back a decade ago. And you can see that every time the market's been over $2, the price increase hasn't lasted indefinitely. That in fact, in 2014-15, when there was a drought in Brazil previously, the market spent very little time over $2. And so from a historical perspective, and I could even go back and look at 1997, when the market rallied to $3.18 a pound, or 1994 when we're at $2.75. Really, the maximum number of months that the market spent over $2 was 6 to 7 months. It really didn't spend, for most bull moves in coffee, an extended amount of time over $2. And the reason why is because that has given a green light signal to coffee growers to expand production, and also for some shifts in consumption. And so here we are, the market's holding over this level, and there is a down seasonal that typically occurs in the market where prices tend to rally in May, and then from June, July, August, the market comes under pressure from the Brazilian harvest. And the expectation now is a lot of talk about how the 23-24 Brazilian crop is going to have a very strong recovery. And so that's the framework that we're dealing in right now for the market. And I went to Brazil 5 times in the past year and a half and have looked at the fields and have, seen many of the coffee farms, and I've seen the production. I've spoken about it and the problems that exist. And I also had an opportunity to see the recovery in the trees since last year's frost. And so certainly there is a lot of cause to believe that the next crop, assuming the flowering is excellent, could see a strong recovery from this year's damaged crop. Now, this past week, it was very cold in Brazil. In fact, it was the coldest recorded temperatures for the month of May. There's never been a frost in Brazil in mid-May. But the damage that was done, even though it was startling to know that there was a frost last week, the actual damage that was done was exceedingly limited. Certainly, it was terrible for the farmers that might have experienced some losses. But in terms of the total production in Brazil, it was like a thimbleful in a bathtub or an ocean. It really is not going to have any material impact on the outlook for the 23-24 crop. In fact, some of you might remember that several years ago, there was another cold snap in Brazil that people thought would impact the 2021 crop. And it turns out that crop proved to be a record amount. The extent of the frost was very small compared to all of Brazil's production. And so it has to be kept into perspective. So there was a lot of social media noise last week and the market raced up, but the market was really correct in coming back down because the damage was very limited. Now, what is the way forward? So certainly there's a problem in terms of the 22-23 crop, and there's very varied estimates on what this harvest is going to be. My own personal view is that some of the estimates are overstating the crop, and then there are some estimates that are the very low end, and I think they're too extreme. But if we put the estimates into context and use numbers that were recently released by CONABI, the Brazilian Coffee Forecasting Agency, I want to show you the numbers here. First off, Brazil has an on-off production cycle. So you have for Arabica production. So 1 year production is higher and the next year production is lower. And that is because of the trees needing a period of rest and also farmer action, because some of the farmers will practice zero safra, meaning the smaller producers will have all their production 1 year and then skeletonize, prune their trees and have no production the next year. So they always have a higher yielding crop. Now, some farmers took the decision after they had losses in 21-22 to hold off on skeletonizing their crop, hoping for recovery and some income in 22-23, and they didn't get it. Now, those farmers are going to be forced to skeletonize their trees and not have production in 23-24. And so there's a balance, because we have to understand that some of the trees that were lost from the frost last year aren't coming back into production in 24-25. And also the vegetative health started the year very poorly. So I think that there's some strikes against 23-24, and it's not guaranteed that it's going to be this major comeback and exceed the production of the record production of 2021. Do I think it's going to be a strong recovery? Absolutely. But can we guarantee that it's going to be a new record crop? Absolutely not. And then if you look at this and you look at the alternating years of the higher crops, what you see is that it actually took time for production to recover and then have a new high. So let's look at the jump in production in 22-23 and how many years it took for Brazil to have another spectacular record crop. We went from the year 22-23, the season 22-23, all the way until 2016-17 before we had another record crop. So you have a situation where the conditions in Brazil on most years are actually not ideal. It's very hard to have that record crop and everything go seamlessly from start to finish. And so I think it's a lot for the market to expect that Brazil is going to have this major recovery in 23-24. Well, let's talk about the 22. Let's walk back to 22-23 and point out a couple of factors here. So as an on-year crop, it is going to be the smallest in many years. So we have not had as small a crop for the on-year in about a decade. And when you look at the crop compared to last year, now the 21-22 crop was also hurt by drought. And so it was a smaller off-year crop. And we didn't have a strong recovery because we had continued drought and we also had the frost. So for the 22-23 crop, it's really more like a off-year crop size than on-year crop size. The Robusta crop is seeing continued strides and is expanding, and that's helping to buffer some of the losses in the Arabica production. Now, historically, CONAB was fairly low relative to other estimates and the USDA. But I have to say that in recent years, CONAB has been trying to make strides in their efforts to legitimize their production using satellite technology and really focusing on trying to have a number that is more credible than the market ever believed before. So when we look at the numbers in the past, you could always see that CONAB was under the USDA number. The USDA has not yet published a figure for 22-23. What I would look at as a result instead is not so much the numbers comparing USDA and CONAB, but instead look at the trends. And for both forecasting agencies, they're fairly close in what they are saying. There is an exception, and that was 3 years ago, where the CONAB number was very low compared to USDA, uncharacteristically so. But in most other years, there's fair agreement between them, at least in the net changes from 1 year to the next. So CONAB number is 35 million. Typically, I'd say, okay, if they're 35, then USDA is going to come out somewhere of 39 to 40 million bags. That number, the USDA report, the official report comes out in the middle of June, but there's an attaché report that could be released any day now with those figures. When we're looking at Brazil, and here's just the on years in coffee production, so you could see it more clearly in terms of how small this crop is relative to the past 3 on-year crops. And there's certainly been a lot of renovation in some of the coffee areas in Brazil. And you could see that overall production was trending higher over the past decade. Even with, at times, coffee prices having been depressed, Brazil continued to expand their coffee park, plant denser, and that is helping to boost the yields per hectare. The exception and what broke that trend was in 2014-15 because of the drought, and then again for 22-23. Do I feel that Brazil is going to continue to increase production longer term and continue on this trend? Absolutely, even with higher costs of inputs and fertilization. Now, what has the impact been in terms of the supply, the flow of coffee from Brazil? So here's monthly Brazilian coffee exports for the 21-22 season, and the Brazilian crop year we measure from July to June. So we have 10 months data, and then on the Café website, which is the organization that publishes the export data from Brazil, they also release daily data, and the cumulative numbers for May show that production is also going, exports are also way down for this month. And that follows a seasonal pattern where we have Brazilian coffee shipments rising from September through December, reaching a peak, starting to level off, and then drop in the last few months. So I don't see where there's alarm on that. A lot of people are talking about, well, Brazil's hardly shipping anything right now, but it meets the seasonal pattern. And also when prices were very high and you had backlogs because of the container shortage this past year and the high freight rates, there were some delays in shipments. And that's why the March exports were really as strong as they were, because there was a lot of coffee that was held over or backlogged and came into the system. So that the pattern is really holding. You look at the November exports at how low they were. That was because of problems in the freight market and not because Brazil didn't have the supply. It was sitting in warehouse. Now, let's look at the cumulative numbers though. Okay, so if you look at what has been shipped year to date from July to April, you can see that the total for Brazil is down absolutely considerably from last year when there was the record 2021 crop available. And with high prices, there was strong incentive to export. And when I talk about high prices, I'm not only talking about the New York price, I'm talking about Brazilian, the internal price where the market is converted into the Brazilian currency. And that gave very, very strong incentive because the Brazilian currency was so weak last year. It put the market at record highs. And therefore there was every incentive for strong exports and also the green light for expanding production in the future. So even though the New York market did not see record high prices last year, the market fell short of that, barely got over 260, whereas the record highs in the market were 318. Quoted in Brazilian real, the price was incredible. So the prior record high in real, if you want to look at it here, was 500 real, okay, 1,000 real. We hit levels never seen before for the price in real. Okay, so I have it the currency, you could quote it in either way, but the price was outstanding. And that encouraged the high volume of exports. And this chart shows how anytime you have a positive relationship with the Brazilian real, you see the export flow increasing. Okay, so going back to the slide, now we've had a back off in the supply, and the cumulative exports are still running behind the prior 2 years. So that does show the slightly smaller crop. And there was also a lot of holdover coffee from 2021. People are still debating how much coffee was really produced in Brazil in that year. Some believe it was much greater than some of the estimates that are available, and that the inventory levels, which, by the way, there hasn't been an official figure that normally is released by CONABI for March stocks. They haven't published that in 2 years. So the market's running a little blind on that figure. But for right now, the market has been adequately supplied. And here we're talking about 1 year versus the next, but there's also been some issues on the demand side, okay? And with high prices and soaring retail prices in Brazil, I also believe that there was a slowdown in local demand in Brazil, and that enabled Brazil to actually have more coffee available for export than otherwise would have been. But the 22-23 crop isn't going to be enabling Brazil to see a recovery in export volumes. There's very little increase in that availability. Brazil's going to have a bigger Robusta crop. That will help somewhat, but you're not going to see a return to these very high levels from Brazil. So that means other countries are going to help, or are going to be needed to help fill that gap. And that's exactly what we've seen in the past few months, where higher shipments from Honduras and Uganda and Vietnam have offset some of the reduction from Brazil. And so total exports are, on a global basis, are really not much less than they were the prior year. Now let's look at, clearly Brazil is number one, and let's look at the situation in Colombia, because that's really troubling as well. Brazil has had their problems, but you can't ignore what has happened in Colombia. During periods of La Nina, you tend to have erratic rainfall in terms of the timing of the rain, and too much rain, and it creates a small crop. And we're having a similar situation now. Every single month this year, Colombia publishes their production on a monthly basis. And the first time in 12 years, every single month this season so far, Colombia has produced less than they did last year. And it's adding up on a cumulative basis. So the information is available October through April, and you could see how much lower the numbers are. The USDA, in their last estimate, was forecasting for the 21-22 Colombian crop to total 13.8 million bags. If we have the production for the balance of this year continue at the same course as it's been on, Colombia might not produce more than 11.1 million bags. So it'll be very similar to or not as extreme as the shortfall over a decade ago, but still very low production out of Colombia. Colombia is the second largest Arabica supplier to the market. And this tightness is being reflected in the differentials for Colombian coffee. So the differential, which is in other markets, it's called the basis, the difference between the cash market price and the New York C futures contract is the differential. And it's currently at 71 cents over for Colombia. Okay, so let me fast forward a second here. Here's Colombian exports, obviously lower because of the reduced supply. And I want to show you, I thought I included here, the differential for Colombian coffee. So just to show it to you here. What we're looking at is the differential at 71 cents over when the market is sitting over $2 per pound. That is huge. Back in 2009, when Colombia suddenly had a shock shortfall in their crop because of a combination of the too much rain, La Nina linked, and doing a rehabilitation program for the removing some of their older trees and replanting. That's why the production numbers came down so hard. We had the differential soar to $1 per pound, but the futures market was only at $1.25. So the only other time in history where Colombian differentials are as strong as they were was just over a decade ago. And at that time, the market screamed higher. It went from, suddenly the market took notice of the problems in Colombia, and the market went from $1.25 to $3.18 per pound, or just over $3 per pound, in panic over the supply situation in Colombia. And so here we have a very, very similar situation going on now. The forecasts are for La Nina to continue, at least through the next several months. And so we have to continue to watch the weather in Colombia, and what is that going to do to the main crop outlook, the harvest from October through March of next year. It is very troubling, and the market is going to have to adjust for that. So how does the market adjust for that? It either does it by the price rallying or by differentials strengthening. And so if Colombia is priced too high relative to Guatemalan coffee or Peruvian coffee, Ecuadorian coffee, whatever other origin, then buyers are going to say, what's your next best coffee? And they're going to buy up Guatemalans or Costa Ricans, okay, Peruvian coffee, and seek to make switches in their blends where possible to balance the market. So when you have a shortage in one country, it might not mean that there's a worldwide shortage. It becomes a regional shortage. And therefore, the differentials react, and then the market has to allocate other coffee to meet that demand. And that is what is happening right now. So here, just skipping around the presentation, you could see how Colombian prices normally track very closely to other mild prices, and then this year surged ahead because the problems in the Colombian crop. Okay, and when you look at it, the markets are all tracking the different types of growths. These are defined by the ICO classifications: Colombian milds, other milds, Brazilian naturals, and robustas. You can see the disparity growing, and that's because of this tightness in the Colombian milds, which means then that other producers should benefit from this and ride the coattails of the problems right now in Colombia. So other mild producers will see increased demand because of the shortfall and higher prices in Colombia. Let me go back. to where I was before. So again, the export numbers out of Colombia are going to be low, and that's going to demand that other countries are going to have to fill that gap. Now, last year in May, there was some protests in Colombia and blockages at the port, and that was why the May numbers were so low. And then you had Colombia make up those shortfalls later on. So let's look at some other numbers here. Honduras is an important consideration for the market as well. And you could see that the exports out of Honduras the past few months have dropped suddenly. And that also creates a potential concern for the market. Now, why is Honduras an important consideration for the New York market? And that is because Honduras is one of the few countries that delivers coffee against the New York contract. So there's many coffees that are deliverable against the New York market. Peru is, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Colombia, but you don't see those coffees coming to the board anymore. There used to be greater deliveries, but over the years that has stopped. And the reason why is because the differentials for other origins, other mild coffees, are at a premium. And you could sell your coffee at higher prices in the cash market. So why deliver it to New York at a discount? So part of that is an improvement in quality over time. And then generally the market willing to compensate producers at higher price levels than where the futures market is trading. And Honduras was the only one that had sufficient supply to depress their differential in their price to make it attractive for them to deliver coffee to the board in the past. But there isn't much Honduran coffee now being delivered either. But when Honduras has a large crop, there is precedent for them to use the market, to use the New York C contract delivery mechanism as a best buyer for their coffee, or as, I don't want to use the word dumping ground, because that's really has a sort of negative connotation, but they use the market shrewdly in terms of finding the best buyer. And sometimes that is the New York C contract and the delivery mechanism, as opposed to selling it to someone else. So if you can't find a buyer, deliver it to the board. Okay. And so when they had this big crop 2 years ago, or actually time passes by 4 years ago, that is what happened. And that coffee sat in the New York market for a long time and helped to depress prices because it was readily available. Now, let's look at the stock situation so I could show this perspective. So there's different ways to look at stocks. So when the United States stock figures are released, and they're released on the 15th of the month, what's included in that number is both the total coffee in warehouse and the portion of coffee that is certified for delivery against the New York contract. Now, years ago, and I'm dating myself, in the 1980s and the 1990s, early 1990s, you could only deliver coffee against the New York contract in certified warehouses in the United States. So it was Miami, and it was New York, and it was New Orleans. And then the exchange, which was the New York Board of Trade at the time, expanded that to include European warehouses. And as quality of coffee improved and premiums improved, there was less and less coffee that was being certified for delivery, but also less and less coffee certified for delivery that was stored in the United States, to the point where we have almost no coffee whatsoever of certified stocks in the US. It's basically held in Antwerp. And the reason for that is simple: money, the price. The price of storage in the United States is much more expensive than it is in Antwerp. And therefore, Antwerp wins the lottery, and that's where the coffee's sitting. Okay, so it's not because there's really a shortfall here. Okay, it's just dollars and cents. It didn't make it, it doesn't add up to deliver the coffee where it's more expensive. Okay, and that has to be recognized. So you could look at this picture and you could say, wow, that's really tight, but it's not. Okay, now a little bit of history. In 1997, so there was a frost in Brazil in 1994. And in 1997, supplies did become exceedingly tight. And that was also when you had just-in-time inventory practices and stocks were run down, and you had almost no certified stock. Certified stocks went below 80,000 bags. Right now, we're sitting at about 1.1 million bags, which is on the low side, and the market's going to be watching that, because as those numbers come down, the market tends to rise. So we have to watch that carefully as a potential signal of higher prices ahead. But that coffee isn't sitting in the United States, and it's not going to, because the costs involved. So when we look at United States stocks, we look at the total, and that total includes coffee from Brazil, and it includes other Miles coffee, and it also includes a lot of Robusta coffee, because there's certainly a lot of Robusta coffee that's consumed in the United States. And you could see that there's a seasonal pattern where the stocks tend to build, and then they get utilized during the winter when consumption is higher in the United States during the colder months. In the past 2 years, we have not really had that seasonal build in coffee stocks. They've been relatively stable. And so even with all the exports that have come in, you haven't had this build in inventory. You have a lot of delays and problems during the pandemic. There's every incentive now to say, wait a second, because of supply disruptions, we should be holding higher inventories, not lower inventories, because just-in-time inventory practices aren't guaranteed anymore. We don't really have the same timely shipments and control as there was. And so many in different products are looking to increase inventories, and yet in the United States, we're not seeing that. So if there is a supply disruption and there is a problem, are US roasters really comfortable with the amount of coffee on hand? And I would have to argue it's sort of borderline. There isn't a big volume of coffee that is available. You need to have a certain baseline. Okay, stocks really shouldn't fall below 4 million, because then you have an extremely tight pipeline. So you need working stocks. So not all this coffee is really available, because you have to consider working stocks. So is there maybe 1 million bags extra coffee if needed to cover a shortfall? That's kind of about it. And you could see that of where the stocks were drawn down in 2010 because the problems in Colombia, and that caused the market to race to, $3 per pound. So we had the numbers released a week ago for April. And I want to show, the reason why I'm showing this is because there's also the seasonal pattern. Okay, so the market says, wow, US coffee stocks increased in April. Well, guess what? For the past decade, almost every April, stocks increased. So whenever numbers come out, you can't just look at the number and compare it to the prior year or what was the month before, because there are patterns on a monthly basis. And from my perspective, the stock increase in this past month in the US was very minimal compared to increases in the past. And, very similar to what we had last year, but we should be seeing a greater increase considering the volume of coffee that was shipped out of origin. The stock number should have been higher than what it was. So that's something that I'm watching and paying attention to. So I say there's a seasonal pattern for the coffee futures market. 14 out of 15 years, this market falls June into July. But there's some red flags here that we have to pay attention to. Now, here is the example of how the stocks in New York and elsewhere have disappeared, and most of the coffee is in Antwerp and a little bit in Hamburg, but certainly those numbers have been coming down. There was a brief period for several weeks where you had an influx of coffee from Brazil when there was those heavy shipments, 2-3 months, and it created a small build in stocks. So stocks had fallen briefly under 1 million bags in total, and then went up to just over 1.1 million bags, now is slightly below it. There was a period where there's coffee that was being graded, and that has slowed. There's almost no coffee showing up right now being graded, and I would expect to see some of these stocks again being taken and utilized. Now, let's look at this on a breakdown, and I'll explain it a little further. So here we have the huge buildup in Honduran coffee that I spoke about, and the declines from Mexico and Peru not having any coffee delivered to the board compared to what happened in the past. High differentials, no reason to deliver that coffee. What we have with Honduras is that coffee has been sitting in stock about 4 years. As coffee sits in stock, it accrues age-related penalties on an accelerated basis. So that Honduran coffee is disappearing and is being taken readily out of the market and being pulled from warehouse, because the longer it sits, the greater the discount on that coffee. And so as it gets cheaper and cheaper, it's the cheapest coffee available in the market. So if you're a commercial roaster looking to create a low-priced blend, well, why not take this Honduran coffee? And that's why this coffee is disappearing out of stock. It's not really because there's a shortfall in the market necessarily. I think this coffee would disappear from stock no matter what, because of the price, because it is so deeply discounted. And so that's why it's important to understand that sometimes there's reasons beyond just the supply and demand for movement in and out of certified stock. Okay, a lot of it has to do with financials. And when coffee is deeply discounted, it's going to move. Okay, it's very attractively priced. So that Honduran coffee, it's understandable why it has disappeared. But the Brazilian coffee that was put into stock a year ago hasn't accumulated those deep discounts. It's barely accumulated any penalty discounts, and yet it is still being utilized. And therefore, that coffee shows that there was some tightness and concern in the marketplace, and the market actually needed that coffee to cover supplies when you had this backlog in shipments. So roasters turned to the stock in Antwerp and Hamburg to take that and use what was on hand and drew down that supply. And given the expectation that the 22-23 crop isn't going to see much of a recovery, would expect to see Brazilian certified stocks continue to dwindle and disappear from the board and from the delivery mechanism. And that is going to underpin the futures market and maybe prevent it from falling as much as it otherwise would have. Another sort of final point here is the market is going to continue to be extremely sensitive to fluctuations in the dollar. Now, the dollar had strengthened tremendously, and when the dollar strengthens, it provides incentive to export coffee, not only from Brazil, but other producers. And we've seen the dollar index back off a little bit, which helps to provide some support to coffee prices. We have to also keep an eye on the dollar, and again, especially the dollar relative to the Brazilian real, to help guide the outlook for where coffee prices are going to be. Already discussed the differentials and looking at that. And so with that, I want to say thank you very much for your attention. And of course, I am available for questions that can be fed to me. And I look forward to also participating in the live discussion June 23rd.
Gracias por la presentación, Tony. Amigos, comenzamos a discutir. Como lo han escuchado, el 23 de junio vamos a tener la sesión con Judith para responder en tiempo real las preguntas, pero con Tony vamos a ir abordando quizás algunos de los puntos más resaltantes. ¿Qué comenta, señor Tony Arroz?
Buenos días ante todo, gracias por la invitación. Judith Gaines ha abarcado muchísimos puntos, sumamente varios muy importantes sobre las cosas que están pasando en el mercado y sobre todo interesante ver y comparar los históricos, que es algo que nosotros muchas veces no vemos, ¿no? Como le comenté a Judith, yo siempre me quedo con la frase esta que dijo de que no observamos las banderas rojas, ¿no? Es como cuando vamos a la playa y nos metemos al mar y nos revuelca las olas y después nos damos cuenta que la bandera está en verde, perdón, en rojo. Hay muchas cosas que ver en el mercado y no es solo un tema de que si el mercado está arriba o está abajo, ¿no? Otra cosa que rescato de lo que ella dijo es que el precio lo marca el mercado, lo marca la oferta y la demanda. Entonces, no es que porque la bolsa está arriba o la bolsa está abajo, se paga más o se paga menos en cuanto al tema de Perú. Punto interesante es que también cuando tenemos un mercado sobre los $2 o sobre 200, no dura mucho, dura entre 4 y 7 meses. Y el mercado mismo te dice cuál es un poco la tendencia cuando estamos sobre niveles tan altos, ¿no? Interesante la proyección que da sobre la cosecha brasilera para el 23-24, que prevén que subirá. Igual hay que esperar a ver cómo va la floración para ver si da eso. Entre líneas podría decir de que si sube la producción en Brasil, el mercado también podría retroceder un poco más, ¿no? Conversando con algunos tostadores hace un par de semanas sobre las cosas de lo que está pasando en el mercado, me dicen que los blends, que también lo mencionó Judith, van cambiando. Si hoy día Colombia está muy caro, lo reemplazan por centrales, y si los centrales siguen caros, los siguen reemplazando. Pero hubo un tema interesante que me mencionó un tostador europeo, que ellos en su blend ya usan 50% Brasil y 50% robustas. Con lo cual los cafés finos nos comienzan a dejar un poco de lado, ¿no? cosa que hace 15 o 20 años no sucedía en el tema de los cambios de blends. ¿Qué podemos esperar del mercado? Va a depender nuevamente de la oferta y demanda. Estamos viendo que los stocks van bajando. Otra cosa que mencionó y que siempre sucede es que con precios altos eso incentiva al productor a tener mayores producciones o tal vez sembrar más café, tener mayores hectareaje. Pero volvemos al punto, los precios altos duran 7 meses a lo más y el productor tiene que esperar 7 años para, perdón, 7 años, tiene que esperar 3 años para poder recién comenzar a cosechar si es que empieza de cero, ¿no? Básicamente son las cosas más rescatables que he encontrado dentro de toda la presentación de Youth Games. No sé, tú más bien que has visto, David, había un par de cosas que yo le pregunté a Judith que supongo que el día 23 se verán, ¿no?
Yo creo que podemos adelantar, o sea, la traducción, agradezco al equipo. Por ahí cuando se utiliza la palabra acciones, estamos hablando de los stocks, que es la
Sí.
parte final, que es una de las cosas que mucho preocupa, y cómo ya es esta distinción entre los stocks certificados y no certificados, que también que me parece muy importante. No sé si tú puedes adelantar las preguntas que le hiciste ayer para que la gente pueda un poco ver, y también invitar a los demás a dejar sus preguntas, porque justamente, si no hay preguntas, bueno, pues entonces para que hablamos con Judith el 23 de junio, la idea es justamente ver, estamos en un mercado muy, muy dinámico, hasta cierto punto volátil, como bien lo dijo, no solamente son los 7 meses, sino también que estando a esta etapa, estando ya quizás en el cuarto mes de la campaña brasileña, todavía no tenemos certeza. Y como dijo, no tenemos certeza de la campaña actual, pero tampoco me pareció interesante, Tony, que no tenían certeza de la campaña anterior en Brasil, porque tampoco tenían certeza sobre los stocks. ¿Cómo lo ves tú?
Bueno, entre las preguntas puntuales que le hice a Judith fue que la presentación se basó todo sobre temas fundamentales de café, ¿no? Oferta, demanda, cosecha, precios, pero yo le pregunté cuál va a ser el accionar de los fondos en el desarrollo de los precios, ¿no? O qué posición podrían tomar los fondos. Y lo otro que comenzamos a ver era, si bien es cierto, tenemos un mercado sobre 200 y buscamos, y la tendencia es bajista, si ella ve que en algún momento podríamos regresar a los niveles promedios del mercado, yo hablo de un nivel promedio del mercado alrededor de del $20, $40, 120 o 140, ¿no? Momentáneamente me dice que no lo ve a esos niveles, con lo cual da a entender que podríamos estar con mercados todavía atractivos, entre lo que llamo atractivos entre 150 y 180, y por ahí tocando picos de 200, ¿no? Y si lo quieres ver todavía más dramático, si no ve mercados ahorita alrededor de $20, mucho menos lo va a ver por debajo de $1, ¿no? Que es cuando ya es un poco más crítico para el lado del productor.
Sí, no, además queda claro que, pero eso es incertidumbre de información o incertidumbre, no sé, de lo que está ocurriendo con el clima y todos los fenómenos, ya los contenedores y demás. ¿Tú cómo lo relacionas un poco más? O sea, yo me quedo con esta frase, no sé ni siquiera cuánto se produjo en Brasil, y nos mostró esta diferencia entre USDA y la CONAB brasilera, que es sistemáticamente fuerte, ¿verdad?
Yo creo que es una combinación de cosas, empezando con el tema, con la pandemia, el COVID, ¿no? El COVID nos ha tenido más o menos encerrados, digamos, a nivel mundial, tal vez 1 año o 2 años, dependiendo en el país que hayas estado, ¿no? Y que no hayas tenido una información tan real de lo que estaba pasando. Ese por un lado, el shortage o ¿cómo se llama? Y además de que la pandemia hizo el cambio de consumos, ¿no? Yo justo mencionó del incremento en el consumo interno brasilero. Acá mismo los consumos cambiaron un poco y ya no era tanto consumo de cafetería, se volvieron un poco consumos más de casa, por lo mismo que no había mucha posibilidad de salir. Eso aunado al tema de lo que mencionabas de los transportes, eso se ve reflejado en las compras de los cafés certificados, ¿no? Que son los cafés que se entregan a los distintos almacenes de la bolsa. Y como ya dijo, depende de cómo esté el mercado, si a qué país le conviene o no le conviene entregar café a bolsa, ¿no? Pero hemos visto que creo que desde el 2011 no se entrega café en bolsa, un poco para que alguna gente que no sepa mucho, tenga poco tiempo en el mercado, para que Perú sea atractivo entrar en bolsa, el diferencial para Perú tiene que estar en negativo, ¿no? Básicamente eso es lo que yo creo que lo que es una combinación de todos los factores que han ido pasando últimamente. El clima, si bien cierto, está cambiando, y está cambiando igual a nivel mundial. Solo como ejemplo, hablábamos o se hablaba de una proyección en Lima de un clima de temperatura mínima de 11.5 o 11 grados, y hace 2 días tuvimos la baja histórica, o sea, la baja de 10.9 en plena tarde. Entonces, ese es un factor que no puedes predecir. Y en el campo menos, ¿no? O sea, hemos visto que con temas de clima, la planta reacciona de distintas formas, entonces te da más o menor producción.
Invito al señor Luis Navarro. Lucho, ¿tú qué comentario general de la presentación de Judith nos puedes dar? Yo creo que da ciertas luces, pero sigue siendo un panorama todavía digamos, no tan claro, ¿verdad? Menos predecible.
Bueno, lo único predecible es la impredictibilidad de este mercado, de este negocio, ¿no? O sea, siempre ha sido así. Hoy día tenemos los precios subiendo y bajando. Hoy día el mercado subió $8 prácticamente de la mañana, habiendo caído igual cantidad un par de días atrás. Yo quería comentar solamente 2 cositas para poner perspectiva de largo plazo que ha conseguido, que ha comentado Judy. Uno es el tiempo que el mercado se sostiene encima de $200. Eso evidentemente es porque la industria es incapaz de trasladar esos precios al consumidor final. No nos olvidemos que el café a nivel de retail, a nivel de consumo final, es un producto que tiene demanda inelástica. O sea, es un producto que si, digamos, si bajara el precio a la mitad, no vamos a tomar el doble de café. Simplemente eso, ¿no? En esos casos, ¿qué ocurre? Ocurren 2 cosas, como lo mencionó Judith. La producción se incentiva y hay más café, entonces inmediatamente el precio se ajusta. Pero lo otro es que ocurre el reemplazo de cafés. Las grandes industrias, los grandes tostadores, el volumen grande de café a nivel mundial son manejados por grandes compañías que tienen grandes marcas en el mercado. Y evidentemente comienzan a introducir calidades inferiores que hacen que el precio baje, pero la calidad se mantenga dentro de la expectativa del público. Y ahí hay un cuadro muy interesante que Judith lo muestra, que es lo que llaman el arbitraje. El arbitraje es la diferencia de precios comparativos entre las cotizaciones de Londres y Nueva York. Nueva York, como ustedes saben bien, cotiza los arábicos y Londres los robustas. Y en el cuadro que Judith muestra, el precio comparativo de un robusta contra un arábica es $70 el robusta contra 220 ¿cómo se llama? El arábica. Ustedes ven ahí más de $100 y pico de diferencia. Y eso evidentemente va a conllevar, si el mercado se mantiene encima de $200, a que la gran industria comience a buscar reemplazos en calidades, digamos, con hilones brasileños, robustas vietnamitas o Indonesia, etcétera, ¿no? Y eso evidentemente va a hacer pues, que efectivamente la demanda por cafés arábicos caiga. Ahora, ¿qué va a producir eso? En el escenario que se ha planteado, digamos, en la medida en que los stocks entregables en la bolsa son pequeños, Nueva York no va a bajar mucho porque los compradores van a tener que comprar lo que han vendido. Pero sí puede afectar, digamos, el diferencial. En este momento es un premio. Hay otro factor que también va a incidir en este análisis, que es los altos costos logísticos. Ya están al tanto de lo que ha ocurrido y Para dar un ejemplo, hace un año, o sea, en lo que ha pasado el año pasado, el costo de transporte se ha cuadruplicado para mover café de cualquier origen ¿cómo se llama? A los puntos finales de destino. Y si la guerra en Ucrania se sigue moviendo, evidentemente los precios del petróleo van a seguir subiendo y eso va a seguir afectando a los costos logísticos y por tanto los costos de importación que se van a tener que trasladar al momento de factorizar el precio, ¿no? Y también para terminar el tema de la demanda, si sigue la incertidumbre, los lockdowns en China, por ejemplo, que cierra muy fuerte, el consumo ya no va a crecer en la medida que se esperaba, ¿no? La guerra con Ucrania y ¿cómo se llama? Rusia, casi dio Croacia, por si acaso no debemos estar, Ucrania y Rusia, significa un consumo acumulado entre los 2 de 6 millones de sacos que van a salir de la ecuación. Entonces, el escenario, si bien es cierto, se presenta por el corto plazo interesante en la medida que el mercado de Nueva York va a mantenerse firme, no hay que esperanzarse en que esto va a durar mucho tiempo. Como Tony lo planteó y lo dijo también Judith, hay que ver la historia. Los periodos de tiempo en que el mercado esté encima de 200 duran poco. Así que ajustar un poco las tuercas a final del lápiz, sacar la cuenta bien, para tener la seguridad de no estar apostándole al mercado en contra, ¿no? Eso es básicamente mi comentario. Espero que cualquier cosa lo anoten, hagan la pregunta y cuando Judy esté disponible ya confirmamos lo que hemos dicho o nos corrige.
Sí, o además el dato cambiará probablemente a cómo van las
Sí,
cosas.
muy probable, sí, efectivamente. Sí.
Y bueno, yo también ayer, Tony hizo un par de preguntas a Judith, no sé si quieres hablar, pero antes quiero agradecer a quienes permiten que se haga la convención. Hemos arrancado en esta modalidad virtual. Invitamos que se inscriban, dejen sus preguntas sin timidez. Veo el público participante es bastante especializado. Igual, por favor, las preguntas. Agradecer a la cooperación suiza y a el Betas, que financia el proyecto C competitivo, el cual implementa la Cámara. A USAID, que mediante Tecnosurf implementa el proyecto Alianza Café y la Alianza Cacao del Perú. También a FedEx, a Sharp, a Romex, Olar, Rainforest Alliance y al PNUD, que son quienes nos están apoyando en la gestión de este evento. Y como ustedes saben, es un evento abierto y todas las sesiones virtuales van a ser abiertas. Entonces, Tony, la última pregunta, quizás antes de cerrar este panel, ¿cuáles crees tú que son las preguntas para plantearle a Judith? O las preguntas que tú crees que sí son, de alguna manera, toda la gente piensa que el precio va a durar, toda la gente piensa que Perú puede abastecer toda la demanda que existe. ¿Cuáles serían de alguna manera esas cosas que nosotros desde Perú tenemos que preguntarnos en este contexto de mercado?
Bueno, yo le preguntaría si el mercado sube o baja, pero me va a contestar seguramente que hay 50% de probabilidades de que suba. Con lo cual, si ella supiese, si supiese bajarse, supongo que estaría dedicada a otra cosa y no a esto. ¿Que el precio durará? No, no creo que dure. O sea, si volvemos al tema histórico, mercados sobre 200 no los hemos tenido siempre, como ella mencionó, duran de 4 a 7 meses. Y hemos visto que históricamente 3 o 4 veces en los últimos 15 o 20 años hemos estado sobre los 200 dólares. Tal vez volvamos a un punto de equilibrio, un precio de equilibrio alrededor de los 150, 160. Si Perú cubrirá toda la demanda, personalmente no creo. Yo creo que hay que seguir mucho. Un tema importante que mencionó también yo es el diferencial de Colombia. Con un diferencial de más 70 en Colombia, me hace recordar el año, creo que fue 2014 o 2011 o 12 por ahí, en que los colombianos entraron al Perú y comenzaron a llevarse todo el café. O sea, no solo la segunda como ahora, sino se llevaban, que te compraban el café en pergamino. Muchas veces, en esa época, yo me acuerdo, llegaban a la planta y nos daban la plata adelantada y se llevaban el café 2 o 3 meses después, ¿no? Eso también podría ser que pase y no tanto se manda al exterior, por lo mismo que mencionó Lucho. Tenemos unos costos que han subido 4 veces. Entonces, solo por citar un ejemplo, para llevar un café de Estados Unidos le va a ser más barato comprarle café a México o a Centroamérica, que los tienen ahí a la vuelta de la mano, que a nosotros. O en Europa comprar cafés africanos o asiáticos también están mucho más cerca lo que estamos nosotros, que todavía encima estamos para el otro lado, ¿no? Eso es en cuanto a los temas de precios y oferta que tengamos, ¿no? Y va a depender también de cuánto es nuestra producción. Ahorita tenemos que estamos ya casi finales de mayo y la gente anda hablando de que no hay café. Entonces, bueno, es un poco la historia que siempre tenemos. O sea, todos los años siempre nos dicen, tenemos 15, 20, 10% de merma comparado con el año pasado, pero siempre a final de campaña aparece. Pero hasta ahora, aparentemente, no hay café, o es lo que mucha gente dice que no está viendo café. Ahora ya, obviamente, estamos viendo solo la parte de las zonas bajas, ¿no? Entonces, básicamente yo creo que va a depender mucho de eso, va a depender mucho del diferencial y sobre todo, qué pueda pasar en Perú, va a depender mucho de los precios internos.
Sí, es cierto, sí, es cierto. Hay una pregunta sobre agroquímicos y el precio de la gasolina, que creo que la vamos a abordar para la sesión del 23 con Judith. Y yo me quedo también quizás con quizás una de las cosas que, enlazando con lo que dice Tony, ¿verdad? Judith le puso bastante énfasis al tipo de cambio. El tipo de cambio es una variable que realmente juega su partido aparte en los países productores. Entonces, y eso también, de alguna manera, pues puede generar mayores expectativas y de alguna manera también es una variable que incluye en el análisis. Perú ha tenido una variación en el último año de casi 20% de su tipo de cambio. Entonces, que de alguna manera que se podría decir se sumó a la tendencia internacional. Hay una pregunta más acá que estamos recibiendo. ¿En qué se diferencia, bueno, ustedes dos? No, bueno, ya hay varias preguntas, disculpen, que les están haciendo por Facebook, no por link, no por el Zoom. ¿En qué se diferencia el café peruano del mexicano o el colombiano? No sé quién la puede responder en breve.
Un segundo.
Con el colombiano son muy similares,
Sí.
no hay problema. El colombiano es un poco más baja calidad, esto tiene menor diferencial. Básicamente eso, ¿no? Ustedes preguntarán por qué la diferencia de premios entre Colombia, que está en 70 arriba, y Perú, que está pues máximo, como optimistamente, 30 arriba. Hay $40 de diferencia, que es el doble. Y es sencillo, el café colombiano tiene una demanda sólida. Colombia es una campaña fuerte, agresiva y sostenida para introducir su marca como café colombiano, 100%, desde el año 40, que comenzó la campaña de Juan Valdés. Entonces, hoy día, los mercados, y particularmente el mercado norteamericano, demanda y necesita, pide y reclama café colombiano. En el caso de otros orígenes como Perú o Honduras, que tienen una calidad similar, pero que digamos, no tienen esa demanda, simplemente uno te reemplaza al otro. Aquí los que están en el negocio siempre no van a dejar mentir. O sea, cuando tú negocias café, te dicen, ¿cuánto quieres? Tanto. Ah, no, Honduras está más barato que tú, compra Honduras. Y el hondureño es lo mismo que nosotros. Con Colombia no se puede hacer esa cuestión. Y para confirmar lo que les digo, el año 2009, que fue el año en que Colombia perdió su producción, la vieron los gráficos que mandó Judith, bajó de 11 millones de sacos a casi 7 millones de sacos la producción, que fue justamente la época que comenzaron a llevar café peruano para reemplazar el café para consumo interno. El diferencial de Colombia llegó a ser más 100 y Perú llegó a 25 nomás, lo cual demostró un poco la gran diferencia que hay entre uno y otro, ¿no? Hoy en día somos un poquito más cotizados, pero es difícil que podamos llegar a tener esos niveles de precio que tiene Colombia.
Tony, ¿algún comentario final? Si no, siendo 11 y 15, ya estamos por cerrar
Sí, o sea,
panel.
básicamente lo mismo que dijo Lucho. Es verdad, las calidades son muy similares, nuestra calidad es muy similar con la de Colombia. Cuando pasó ese tema de la baja de producción colombiana, mucha gente reemplazaba un poco Colombia por Perú. Colombia, como país, como gobierno, invirtió más en temas marqueteros, cosa que nosotros no tenemos, con el tema de Juan Valdés. Todo el mundo conoce Juan Valdés, o inclusive hasta en los, ¿cómo se llaman? Los partidos de fútbol hablan de país cafetero y siempre mencionan a Colombia, ¿no? Nosotros no tenemos eso. No tenemos nada, no tenemos una marca registrada, no tenemos marketing. Me acuerdo que hubo inclusive unos años en que tú veías la propaganda de Juan Valdés en los partidos de tenis. En Wimbledon, en Roland Garros, aparecía la propaganda de Juan Valdés. Y el otro punto es también un poco más seriedad, ¿no? Hay más seriedad en cuanto a exportaciones y confiabilidad hacia el extranjero, hacia los colombianos que hacia los peruanos.
Sí, hay un valor postventa ahí en cómo atendemos al cliente más allá del producto y ese vínculo de largo plazo. Bien, yo les agradezco, invito a todos a inscribirse. Mañana tenemos a Carlos Brando en vivo, no va a haber traducción, Carlos Brando habla fluido el español y vamos a hablar de los nuevos procesos de especialidad, del café de especialidad y de los mercados internos. Cómo se está, lo que Judith ha mencionado y hemos visto, hay un incremento de consumo en países productores y es un consumo que se da en varios niveles. Mañana con Carlos Brando vamos a abordar esto. Los invito a que se inscriban y también que se inscriban. Ya estamos lanzando la inscripción para el evento presencial que va a ser el 30 de junio y el 1 de julio acá en el Hotel José Antonio en Lima. Muchas gracias, Luis. Muchas gracias, Tony. Y a todos, muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Hasta luego.
Saludos, nos vemos. Chao, chao.